One of the worst things you can have in a track, EDM or otherwise, is a sort of programmed or MIDI feel. And what I mean by that is a given line might sound very static and lifeless when programmed. Some of my friends and I refer to it as sounding very typewriter because there's no dynamics, there's no motion, and no sort of humanity to a part. Very much like this. Right now, that's totally god-awful, okay? So let's look at some different creative ways to bring this to life. We're going to use a combination of velocity editing, sidechaining, but in particular, Autofilter. Now here, we're presupposing an understanding of the different types of filters. If you're not familiar with terms like cutoff, resonance, low pass, high pass, etc., please take a minute and research those recording arts fundamentals on your own. It's beyond the scope of this tutorial to explain all this stuff from scratch. So hopefully you're all caught up on that stuff so we can dig in straight away. Suffice it to say, the auto part of Autofilter is the key here. We're going to be applying the sounds a given filter can produce, but we're going to set this tool up to automatically control the parameters of that filter. Again, to create interest, movement, and a human touch to the line. So let's look at the parts here real quick. First of all, I just brought in a simple full house loop. Anyone who knows me knows that I don't advocate for using a full loop with all of the drums in there for the backbone of your track. I'm not advocating that at all here. What I'm doing is merely trying to create an example. So ideally, you've done all your programming, kick, snare, percussion, whatever. But here's the loop. Standard house loop. We all know it. We all love it. And here's what I'm trying to do. Instead of having a melodic element on top, or instead of even having a vocal on top, what I want to do is I want to create sort of a top-end groove as if I had another player or a percussionist in the room with me. So what I've done is I've simply chosen the sound I like, right? Simple woodblock sound, something that I think will be complementary. Now let's just listen to what those two are going to sound like together. Really not special, in fact, downright annoying. So let's look at some ways that we can spruce this thing up. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I want to get these regions to move around a little bit and create a human feel where a percussionist might push and pull a little bit instead of it sounding, again, so typewriter, so even and metric. But how do we do that short of just moving the regions around? Well, you guessed it. I'm a big fan of this MIDI transform. It gets me out of a lot of jams. I'm going to bring up this humanize thing. I'm just going to select and operate and watch what it does to the timing of my data. Boom, boom. Boom, boom, boom. Not only is it adjusting the timing, but it's adjusting the velocity, which is really cool. So I don't spend too much time trying one, auditioning it, trying one and auditioning it. It's moving it so minusculely, so minutely that it doesn't really matter. I'm sure that this line is now going to work and have a little bit more of a human feel. One thing I might do to take it just a bit further, if I do like the rhythm that it's pumping out, is I might just go to randomize velocity. And I might specifically say, okay, randomize between 90 and the full 127, select and operate, boom, 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 boom. As you can see now, I'm just randomizing velocity. Just those two things alone are really going to bring this to life. Now listen. A little bit better, okay? So we're getting a step in the right direction. If you've seen my previous videos, this one is a really big one for me, auto loads. Auto loads basically make it so that I can import work that I've done in the past. I'm going to go to all files. I'm going to go to this Prohl remix where it was a remix that I did for a friend of mine, Chris Prohl out of the UK, very, very talented house producer. And under audio, I have all the audio stems, but you'll notice down here, I've got my SC kick and my SC clap. Those of you who saw volume 1 of Insider Secrets will recall this trick. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the content and the plugs. I guess there are no plugs. It doesn't really matter. And since these two files have already been pre-flexed, I can bring them in and they will automatically line up to any master clock that I've got going on. So that, again, if you haven't seen that in the last series, I definitely recommend checking that out. That was a big deal. So I'm going to get these out of the way. I'm going to make sure to set both of them to no output because these, again, are supposed to be ghost triggers, no output. And then I like to hit H, hide them. I don't need them. And then what I'm going to do now is on that swung percussion, I'm actually going to hit it with that quarter note sidechain trigger. So I'm going to bring up my compressor. I'm going to set it down here to SC kick, which is, again, right on the quarter note. And now let's see what this sidechain is doing to actually bring some life and some bounce into this very static percussion line. A lot. And as you can tell, I'm just finding the sweet spot. Now, normally these days, I'm trying not to go too far past -5 dB on my sidechains because I just am not really feeling that super thick, bouncy sidechain as much these days, but that's just me. Again, for something like house, I prefer a much more organic sound. All right, so got my sidechain compressor dialed in. So now I've got a combination of the velocity editing, as well as the humanizing, as well as the sidechaining. So let's listen to that against the house loop. All right, getting there. So here's the last thing we're going to do, and this is where the real magic comes from. We're going to use this autofilter to kind of make each stroke have its own envelope, have its own sonic identity. And here's what I mean by that. I have the factory default up now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually tune this thing and see what I can get out of it. And I've already saved a patch that I really like on this, so we'll see how close I get to that patch when I'm done. Now, one thing I want to talk about is we're not going to use the envelope for this. As the title suggests, the trick here lies in the LFO programming. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the envelope here, or I can just simply disable that section. That's a nice update that Logic has for this particular plugin. Very cool. And I'm going to hit play, and let's have a listen to what this autofilter is going to do for my sound. So there's one curve that I might play with. Here's the one I came up with that I thought was actually really cool. Easing up on the amount of sidechain, as well as letting some of the dry mix back in. And now with the groove. And then from here, I can actually even start playing with this as I go. Right, so that is actually a really, really cool trick for sprucing up and kind of bringing some life and dynamics into a very static or programmed part. Now, we just simply did this on a woodblock sound. I've done this on vocal stabs. I've done this on weird hi-hat lines. I've done this on a lot of different elements. You could even do it on things like white noise and stuff like that. You could actually set the auto filter to be affecting not only in this smaller subdivisions, but as much as 4 bars, 8 bars, something like that. You can see that the possibilities are endless for what type of effects you can get out of simply slapping an auto filter on a programmed part. You have to understand that if you weren't using an auto filter, a lot of this stuff you would actually have to do by hand, which isn't a problem necessarily. Just a real quick explanation of how that would look. This is an EQ. One thing that people don't always understand is that EQs and filters are essentially the same thing. I like to think of a filter as just an EQ that's moving, right? So if I was to actually automate this thing, right, that would be a high pass filter. Imagine if this high pass filter was moving like this, or right? It was actually being automated or moving. Well, that's kind of where the auto and auto filter is going to come from, because instead of having to write these curves, we're just allowing the auto filter to just kind of play them for us, like an internal automation. So all I've done here is I've got our same groove that we were talking about with the house loop, the swung percussion thing we talked about in the last video. But now I've programmed your simple 2 and 4 clap. And let's just have a listen to the clap soloed. Cool. Let's see how it works with the swung percussion. Kind of cool. And now let's hear them all together. Have to admit, I'm kind of feeling that even with just these 3 elements here. It's got kind of a nice groove to it. It's got a kind of a nice identity. I like it. It could be the backbone of a pretty decent track. All right, well, here's the trick that we're going to do with the clap now. Go ahead and solo it. I'm going to bring up this auto filter, and I've made this laser clap. We're going to do pretty much the opposite here as far as which section of the auto filter we're using. We're going to get rid of the LFO entirely. In fact, you can disable it here. I've got the envelope mix fairly high up. Understand that if you did this, then 100% of the sound would be affected. So this is really sort of a dry wet. And then, of course, I've got my cutoff and my resonance. But you'll notice down here on the envelope, I've got 0 sustain and a decay, a very quick decay in this particular case. So I'm just going to go ahead and let you listen to this real quick. Last thing is I have a little bit of distortion on the output. Helps when I turn it on. Okay, so totally dry. About halfway. All the way. So laser clap, right? You're getting that sort of laser kind of sound to this. But what's happening here is that this decay, 52 milliseconds, is determining the motion between this cutoff and resonance, how fast or how slow they're dropping. So I can go all the way from 0 to 1,000 milliseconds. Let's listen to 1,000 milliseconds. I'm going to crank this wet up a little bit. Right now there, I'm really getting that sort of longer but more defined lasery sound. That one's a little more twerpy and tweepy, if those are words, music words. And that's what I had originally, okay? Now, why is this cool? Well, you can use this creatively in a few different places. Let's say, for instance, we had this whole section of the track was this rock out section, right? Let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to copy this full house loop down to its own channel. Let's get rid of this. And watch this. I'm going to solo this. And I'm going to bring up an EQ. And I'm going to band pass this. Very, very common trick, particularly in house music, because what you would do is have that groove thin out. So that's a very, very common house trick. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to copy this clap now down to its own track. And on this track is actually where the auto filter is going to kick in. So I'm going to get rid of it on that original clap. I'm going to unsolo everything. And we're just going to hit this section here, sort of like a breakdown chill out section, where this clap is now going to get adjusted and have a little bit more identity going through the breakdown. See what we're going for there? You're just taking the same sound and you're doing some light adjustments to it to keep it alive, to keep it fresh, to keep the ear interested. And it saves you having to reprogram and do all kinds of different compositional elements. It's not really about that with this sort of stuff. You want the crowd to just get that little tricked out feeling, that sense that something is moving, that sense that something is evolving. Last thing I'm going to do with this clap, this breakdown clap, I'm going to send it to its own bus. And on that bus, I have a preset made for the big verb. And the big verb is exactly that. You'll notice it's just a huge kind of cathedral, in this case, hall type verb. And I'm going to send it pre-fader. So now this clap is actually just going to get really, really washy. So there you have it. The sky's the limit. You can play with that on all kinds of different sounds. Again, I've used that even on vocal samples. I've used it on crashes. I've used it on all kinds of different things just to keep parts interesting and make it so that I don't have to reprogram things or add new elements. If anything, I just capitalize further on the parts that already exist. It gives the audience the feeling that something is moving and evolving, but it keeps that sense of familiarity, which is so important in dance music.